Get into the study today, and we begin to talk about restricted areas and open areas. And of course, what we're talking about is the tabernacle. And as the writer of the Hebrews is describing it, we kind of went over it a little bit last week. Had a picture of the tabernacle up, and you were able to see that. Today, we just want to go into just a little more detail about that. And I always really believe that that's always been an interesting study to me. The tabernacle, the way that it was built. I'm talking about that preceded the temple, but just how they had that tabernacle with the fabric, and you figure they had to. It wasn't a permanent place. They had to tear it down and set it up, and of course it was the very presence of God. In our Bible study, restricted areas and open areas access, talk about the blueprint for the earthly place of holiness is described in Hebrews 9:1, called the tabernacle. And if you want to go back and read in the book of Exodus chapters 25 and 27 will give you a real description of the earthly tabernacle and how it was used. But let's go ahead and look at these scriptures and talking about the earthly tabernacle in verses 9, 1 through 5. And so I got to go back over here to read them. Okay. It says, "Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinance of divine service and the earthly sanctuary." Okay. "For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary." And you remember last week we kind of went over that and I showed you the picture of that. "And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all." And so we see this, and then verse 4. "Which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant." Boy, those were some pretty important items, don't you think? And they were really, when you think about that, the different things that were in that, in what we call the holies of holies. And people, even to this day, some people are still searching for that and searching for those items, okay? "And above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat of the things that we cannot speak in detail." And so when we come to that, the first thing that we notice when we think about that, you had the two sections. You had the outer, the sanctuary, and then the inner sanctuary. And today what we're basically working with is that holies of holies, and it's referred to as the restricted area, okay? That in reality it was restricted, just not anybody could go in there. Our Bible study says only the high priest was allowed to enter God's presence in the most holy place. And once he was there, the high priest burned incense, and then it says perpetually, means continuously. This incense had to keep burning upon the golden altar. And again, you can go back to Exodus of chapter 30, 1 through 10. We'll describe that for you. I like what they put in here next. Said he did not so because God wanted a room that smelled like a Glade plug-in. You find a lot of people burning incense and everything else. So you ask yourself, when they answer here, folks that are watching online, I'll have to repeat the answers they give. But why do you think God wanted them to burn the incense? Why did he want them to burn the incense in there? And the incense had to be made very, very specifically. You just couldn't make it any way you wanted. Aaron's sons found that out. It had to be made. But why do you think in this place that there was the reason for that, for the incense? We already determined it's not just to cover up odors. We laugh, Debbie and I laugh at the Febreze commercials.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you talk about somebody going in their teenage room, son, and the room's real dirty and stinks, and so you go in, and so a lot of good, just what you do, you just spray this Febreze stuff, and it just covers up that smell for 24 hours or something, I don't know. Now, some of you that use that, you're going to be real upset at me, aren't you? There we go.
It signifies the prayers of God's people.
Okay, it signifies what, Cynthia? Prayer, okay. Yeah, it signifies prayers going up to the Lord. Well, the incense is a reminder. I mean, the reality of it is the Lord wanted the incense in there so that it would remind the people that they were in God's presence. This is a place where when you come into it, this burning of the incense will remind you that the very presence of God is here. And like Cynthia just said, talking about the prayer, and of course, if you're in God's presence, you probably should be prayerful. You should be at it would be a time of prayer. You'd be communicating with Him. It said the high priest also poured the blood of the sin offering upon the altar once a year. And what's the purpose of pouring the blood then upon the altar? What is it that the blood was representing? You pour the. Okay, it would be a sacrifice. That would be the act of what was taking place. But what would be the purpose? What would it be doing for you and for me if we were that Hebrew person in that day and the priest was going into the holies of holies? Okay, it's the atonement. It's to purify. It's to make clean. Again, acknowledging, even back in the Old Testament, that a man cannot purify himself. He cannot be clean without, of course, God doing a work within him, making that person holy. And so that was the work that was being done in there. And so very, very, very important. It's really exciting, the tabernacle, to really get into the study of it. And then, of course, as we know, we're living on the other side of it. You know, we know what Jesus did for us. And this is all the reason the writer of the Hebrews is bringing all this out, because he wants to say, you guys know how much which they did. Again, put your mind back. You're that 50-year-old Hebrew person. They cherished the temple. They cherished deeply and took it very, very serious what was going on there in the holies of holies and what the priests did every year. So it wasn't anything that was ever taken for granted. Now the question asked us is, was God's presence everywhere back then, or was it restricted to certain places at a chosen time? Okay, so think about that for a moment. Back in the Old Testament, we talk about God's presence being here. And as a matter of fact, let's go ahead and just look at this in the Scripture, and I'll read it to you here. It says, now when these things have been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle performing the services. But into the second part the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. And so we see that, Leviticus chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Now the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they offered profane fire before the Lord. And what happened to them? And they died. That's what I was talking about. And you know, all they did was they didn't mix the incense properly. They were very careless in just how they mixed the incense, and of course they died, and so it shows it. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at just any time into the holy place inside the veil, before the mercy seat which is on the ark, lest he die. For I will appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. And so the question begins to, that we begin to ask ourselves then, and that this asks in our Bible study, was God's presence in the Old Testament everywhere? Okay, some say no.
I think he picked a specific time and place. I don't think he was everywhere.
Okay.
It's where he was held in holiness.
Now what was that, Cynthia?
Well, he wanted a place where he would be held in holiness.
Okay, a place for a specific time and place people meet with him.
Omnipresent, he didn't lose his omnipresence.
There you go, okay. That's what I was looking for. And Cynthia said he didn't lose his omnipresence. Obviously, omnipresence means that we believe in an omnipresent God, that a God that's everywhere. He is everywhere. But in him making himself or revealing himself to men in the Old Testament, he was using specific places like the tabernacle and this holies of holies, and especially between the cherubim that was in the holies of holies. This is where the priest, as they would do their functions, that where God said he would meet with them. And this is what we just read out of Leviticus there. He said, just don't happen in here any old time, and just prepared any old way. Very, very important that they would go in. Atop the ark of the altar, atop the ark was the mercy seat with the two cherubim on there. And so when we say that, we talk about restricted, it seems as though there was just certain times, certain place, certain people that could go into this holies of holies, that could enter what we would call the throne room, the place of grace, the place of mercy. So it was restricted. And what would that mean to us as just kind of regular people, those of us who are not the high priest, not even the regular priest? The high priest is the only one. So what difference can you think about now, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, are wide open, the state of grace, but can you imagine the difference it would have made in your lives? What kind of difference would it have made in your life spiritually back then? Huh? Wouldn't have been as easy, okay. Yeah. Grace is wonderful, isn't it? Yeah. Grace is wonderful. But you think about it, you were dependent, your spiritual life, think how much your spiritual life was dependent on the work the priest did. Think about that. You were dependent, just like he said about Aaron's sons, them to prepare the proper incense to burn, and they didn't do it, and they died. And the Lord was trying to show this is if you're going to function as the priest, or you're going to function as the priest that would just carry out, not even into the holies of holies, but carry out certain duties. He was saying, boy, I want you to be on top of your game. I want you to be on top of it, because if you don't, serious consequences certainly can happen when you see that, because the people's lives, spiritual lives, depended upon it. They depended upon the work. They depended upon the work and the functions of the priest. So again, the writer of the Hebrews is trying to set it up. We see, and he's saying to the people, you know how important the functions of the priests were. You know how important the holies of holies is and was to the people. So you know all of that. And now, I like what he always does. He begins to talk about, let me show you now the better way. Let me show you how much better life is. And so this is where we move on. It said the Holy Spirit indicated this, that the way into the holies of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. And so what he was saying is that this was good, but it didn't do what needed to be done. And then it says it was concerned all with foods and drinks, various washings of fleshly ordinance imposed until the time of Reformation. And so what he begins to say now, this was all done for a certain period of time, but it was all pointing us to where eventually the throne room of God would be wide open. Isn't that great? The throne room of God would open wide. And of course, we know now that it's the person of Jesus Christ that makes this possible. And so in Hebrews 11, or in Hebrews chapter 9, 11 through 13, but Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. And so, again, Paul's saying, the writer of the Hebrews is saying, I always have a tendency to say Paul did it, but the writer of the Hebrews is saying, look, it was so important to have what we had in the tabernacle, but now Christ has perfected this work. Now it is absolutely wonderful what it is that Christ has done. When it asks us the question, what did every high priest take with him into the most holy place and why? We know that he went in and he always took the blood. And it says, why were the holy places closed to non-priests? Because the high priest is the one, just like what we talked about, that had prepared themselves, had performed this function. And the only thing is, it says, what cannot be perfected by the old arrangement. And the reality of it is, they had to do this, we talked about this before, they had to do it year after year after year, the same thing. But now Christ has opened up the way. It says here that Christ changed everything. What is the difference now? Well, that's what we're looking at in verse 11. It's a perfect tabernacle not made with hands, that is not of this creation. So what it is Christ is about to do is that he's about to do what human beings couldn't do. Man made the tabernacle, the man-made tabernacle. Christ comes from God, and born of the Holy Spirit. And so he was going to be able to do literally, it changed everything. Verse 12, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. Now, what does that mean, that he entered the most holy place? Because Jesus never did go into the holies of holies. What's this referring to? Heaven, okay. It's not made with hands. It's not of this world, is what the writer of the Hebrews is saying. He said, there's a place not of this world that is a replica. What was here on earth is a replica of something going on in the heavenlies, of what's going on beyond what you and I see. He says this is beyond us, basically. The work that Jesus is doing. What's that? Sitting at the right hand of the Father. Yeah. But basically that there's this tabernacle that's not made with human hands. So in the heavenlies, there's this place that mirrors, or I should say the earthly tabernacle mirrors what literally takes place in the heavenlies as Jesus becomes this sacrifice before the Father, and that he is fulfilling. No man could go there. No high priest could go there. Only Jesus, the high priest, could enter there. He's the only one that would be able to perfect this and make this work. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh. And so, let me get back here. No, I can't get back. Lost that one. But anyway, talking about the fact that in this, the blood of goats couldn't do it, and the ashes of heifers, the sprinkling, the unclean, and the purifying of the flesh. So those could not do what Jesus was able to do. Verse 14, chapter 9, it's not up there, it says, "How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God." And verse 15, "And for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant, by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance." And so we come back and we talk about it being, the work that Jesus Christ did that opens it wide open for you and for me, and literally for everybody. Think about that, how wonderful that is now to enter. That's why Paul eventually says here in the book of Hebrews, come boldly to the throne. You're able to come with all the confidence in the world that Jesus has done the work. So isn't it great that we move from restricted to wide open? Aren't you thankful for that? Yeah, just like that. And that really makes it so why we should rejoice and be happy in it, because the Lord has done that for us.